It's great to be here. Thanks to all of my friends who are out. And, you know, it's not easy to be my friend. Really, you should be at home today. But anyway, thank you. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to have this discussion. When the rabbi called me, I said, you know, I had a specific understanding. I just can't, in our life the way it is at this chapter, do this, talk about the book at every show in the greater New York area, but my own show. So I'm happy to be here. So on this question of your father and I deciding about the next book, Sadasa will tell you I'm a headstrong guy. You know, I get an idea in my head. Your father really encouraged me to write the Shabbat book. I talked to him about it at various times, and he really pushed me on it. And to a certain extent, the fact that I did not run for a fifth term in the Senate was why I wrote it, because I thought in all that time that I normally would have been running around America raising money for my re-election, suddenly I didn't have to do that. This was maybe the moment to write the Shabbat book. So, you know, a lot of times when I would read a sefer myself and I would see that the author would thank Hashem for enabling him to write the book, or her to write the book, it would seem almost forced and unreal. But I must say that after the Shabbos book, I had that same feeling. I was grateful for the reaction to it. So when your dad was my teacher and friend, or when Menachem urged me to write another book, kept nudging me, because we usually talk every Friday and we're in the Parsha, etc. Occasionally we talk a little politics. He thought about Pesach, and I said, Rabbi, forgive me, but I think the last thing the Jewish world needs is another book on Pesach. So many. But I said, you know, this is part of the problem. There is another holiday to which Pesach is connected, both in days and in substance, and that's Shavuot, and it gets too little attention. So, and it stands for something. It's the critical moment in many ways in Jewish history. Obviously, there are a lot of critical moments between Avraham Avinu and Hashem, but I was taught by my rabbi growing up, that I was probably taught this by Rav Soloveitchik, that the Jewish people did not really become a nation until Har Sinai, when we got our essentially mission statement, got the Ten Commandments, the Torah, etc. And also more broadly, and I talk about this, the impact of the revelation, as we don't call it that often, but the Christians do, on Mount Sinai, giving of the law, had a profound impact on the development of other legal systems, particularly in the Western world. So that's what I wanted to do, and I wanted to, in some sense, market Shavuot, but it also gave me as an opportunity, as somebody who spent most of my life in the law, practicing law, as a state senator, U.S. senator, trying to make laws, and then as an attorney general trying to enforce laws, to write about the law. And I had this thought that, probably influenced by maybe some of Rabbi Sachs's books on the Parsha of the Week, where he does a small comment. Conversations, and I forget what he calls them. Covenant and Conversations, right. There was a representative of the United Kingdom here who, you know, they stick together. Anyway, I thought, so I organized it in 50 short essays about the law. We can talk about it more. And the first time when I got asked to write a book about public service by Simon & Schuster, and they said, we will find you a collaborator, and I said, what? I love to write. I know how to write. No, you'll never do it. You're a senator. So I said, we went around on this. And then I said, well, I have a press secretary. He's a great writer. He knows me very well. He knows my style. It won't happen. He's too busy. So they gave me a collaborator, and actually I ended up not liking him, probably because I hadn't had to work with anybody like that. But then over the years I realized I had to do it. Just to make the book happen, and Rabbi Ganak recommended a very impressive rabbi from Israel from Bar Ilan, Rabbi Ari Khan. I think he's actually originally from the U.S. in New York. He made all the quite a long time ago. So we collaborated on this book. I'm going to make the future answers shorter.
So usually my speeches start short and then they get long. So I'll have to make my questions longer.
Yeah, that's okay.
So speaking of long questions, so you mentioned that you spent your entire professional life in the law, making laws, enforcing laws. So in your book, you have a chapter on lawyer jokes.
Yes.
That was one of my favorite chapters. I read, this is actually, we didn't get up to this yet. If you're reading Keseder, then you're up to the 33rd chapter, but I read all the way to the end. I hope you'll forgive me. So there's a joke in there about a doctor, an engineer, and a lawyer.
Yeah.
This was not a joke that I knew beforehand. But the doctor, the lawyer, the doctor, the engineer, and the lawyer are arguing about who first appears on the scene. So the doctor says that our doctors were here first because God removed Adam's rib. So the engineer says, yeah, but that's already after the creation. Obviously the engineer was there to create order out of chaos. So the lawyer says, yeah, but who do you think created the chaos? So that was good. I didn't know that one. But the chapter is about how, while some people mock lawyers, how law is so critical to how we live our lives, and how lawyers have really a profound influence on us as Americans. And it reminded me of Gemara. The Gemara appears actually 3 times in the Talmud that says, Talmidei Chachamim mar Shalom ba'olam, that those who study the Jewish law promote peace in the world. And it's just interesting that sometimes when we look at scholars who are arguing, be them rabbis, be them lawyers, so they're not promoting peace, they're promoting these arguments. But how somebody who's lived within the law, and my professional life has been very short so far, and I hope that it grows for a long time, but I spent 11 years in yeshiva studying the law, as somebody who's completely encapsulated in the law. So what do you say to the outsider who hasn't experienced that and doesn't appreciate those who study the law, those who doesn't appreciate the value of that study and those conversations?
Yeah, so I told that joke. I could have told worse jokes.
I wanted to, I know since your answer is getting short, you have to choose either the jokes.
Just one. My dear friend John McCain, who's in a battle now himself, but I probably had to hear him 100 times tell this story. He would ask audiences, what's the difference between a catfish and a lawyer? One is a bottom-feeding scum sucker, and the other is a fish. I laugh every time because he laughed every time himself. So God bless him. I should have a leadership. But so actually, the story I led with the story that Robert was kind enough to tell, not only because it's more tasteful than the one I just told, but it allowed me to say that, contrary, of course, some lawyers do act in a way that justifies some of the negative feeling of people, but really, we need law to order our lives and to protect our security and to enhance our lives. And really, that's the point that I'm trying to make in the broader narrative of the book, of the journey from slavery in Mitzrayim to freedom in the Midbar to receiving the law at Har Sinai. That Hashem was really saying to us, freedom is your birthright, if I may say that, put it that way. But freedom is not enough, because we've already seen, beginning with Cain and Abel, and certainly in the world of Noach, that left to our own devices, people will lead to create societies of chaos, violence, immorality, maybe even self-destruction. So we need the law to order and protect us, and we need lawyers to mediate those, to apply the law, to enforce the law. Sometimes through conflict, sometimes through the kind of litigation that goes on and makes people turn sour about the law, but we also believe that in the end that leads to a better, more just, and more sort of truthful society.
So the premise of the book that you just mentioned, the connection between Pesach and Shavuos, which are not just connected by Sfiras HaOmer, but the Ramban notes that Pesach in the Torah is 7 days, and Sukkot in the Torah is 8 days. And Pesach has no Atzeres afterwards, whereas Shmini Atzeres follows Sukkot. And I think my father actually quoted this when he spoke to you last time. The Ramban writes that he thinks that the Atzeres, the last day, the leftover day, is actually Shavuos. Shavuos is like the last day of Pesach. And Sfiras HaOmer is the glue that connects them. It's he says it's like the Chol HaMoed, the middle of Yom Tov. The beginning is Pesach, and the end is Shavuos. It's like a launch pad. It's where it's not, Pesach's not where you stop. Pesach's where you start. I think it's how you actually close the book.
Yeah.
So, and what you describe in the book is that how law, justice in the title, needs to shape our liberty. Emotionally, in your experience, you spent decades and decades inside the law. What does it mean to be elevated by the law? Were there times that you felt like, wow, that is such a good case, that is such a great law, such a great application? Do you ever have an emotional response of inspiration from the law? Like, I'll just say, like the way a student of the Talmud would have when reading the Shtickle Torah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that question. Really, no, it's interesting. So I would say there are times, for instance, when I've read judicial decisions that I've been excited about, because they took the Constitution and applied it to a real-life situation and came out, in my opinion, doing the right thing. So, and sometimes they did it by correcting a previous bad decision. So the most sort of obvious, maybe graphic in my lifetime was the civil rights decisions. That that we had this incredible decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which essentially concluded that slavery was constitutional. And then, beginning with Brown versus Board of Education in the 50s, the court said no. And there's some really moving decisions. Sometimes, if I get, I'm going to be somewhat funny, but true too. Sometimes, if I get, thank you, if I get a little bit the bad taste of the way the 2000 election ends, I read Justice Stevens' dissenting opinion in the Supreme Court case. And it's very moving. I mean, he says that we may never know who actually won the 2000 election, but one thing we do know is that I'm searching for the word exactly, that the credibility and reputation of the court for being independent of politics has been compromised by this decision. It was really harsh. So anyway, but I'd say about lawmaking, which I did more of, 10 years in the state senate, 24 years in Washington, 34 years, the old line that sausages and laws should not be seen as they're being made. Because there's compromise. But on the other hand, if you're part of something that really works, and usually takes negotiation and compromise, I was early in my career in the Senate. I worked very hard on a bipartisan basis, really unusual. When I think about it now and talk about it, it sounds like it was another world. President Bush, 41, and Democrats in the Senate, led by George Mitchell of Maine, basically agreed that we need to improve our clean air laws. Nature was being badly affected by dirty air. People's lives were being shortened by dirty air. And we worked together. It was a long process, but we compromised, we negotiated, we came up with an agreement. We stuck with it on the floor of the Senate didn't support amendments, even if they were ones that we liked more than the bill, and it got adopted. So that was a good feeling. All the opportunity, probably the opportunity that I had, just because I happened to have been there to really be in the middle of all the post 9/11 legislation, creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Next time you get badly treated by TSA, don't call me, but you can blame it on me. And then the reform of the intelligence community these were the most significant changes in our national security organizations since the late 40s, at the beginning of the Cold War. That's because we were beginning a new epoch. So that was thrilling when it was, even though it was give and take, negotiation, blah blah blah. It was thrilling. I had some thrilling ones as Attorney General too, but that's another story. But no, when you know, I'm sorry, I'll finish. When Fritz Mondale.
You can have as much time as you want, because when I speak, I take as much time as I can.
So rabbis and politicians, including former similar feelings. So when I was running for Attorney General, Walter Mondale came into the state, and he was nice enough to speak at a dinner for me. That was 1982. He was planning to run for president 2 years later. Anyway, he had been Attorney General of Minnesota, U.S. Senator, and Vice President. And he said to me, the best job I ever had was Attorney General of Minnesota. I said, you're kidding. Why do you say that? He said, because when you're Attorney General, all you do, excuse me again, is sue the bastards. You're always on the right side. And it was very, particularly in environmental and consumer protection, it was great to be able to get relief for people who needed it. So those are some personal highs in answer to the question I was never asked before.
A lot of things happen here first. You mentioned the civil rights movement. In your book, you tell the story about the time that you met Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Could you reflect on the civil rights movement in general, Martin Luther King in particular, on your experience and on your life?
Right. So I mean, just you start. Well, look, so I was raised, to believe in the Torah, and everybody is created the Talmud Elohim. My rabbi was very much in the community, in the broader community, not just in the shul. Kennedy runs for president, excites my generation a lot about public service. And so I began to participate in civil rights protests in Connecticut when I was at Yale. And then in the summer of 1963, I was working as an intern for my senator, Abraham Ribbelkopf, who was also a hero to me, and became a mentor, really. And in August of that year was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So I went, participated. Of course, I was at the Lincoln Memorial when Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech. The first time I told our kids that, they looked at me like I told them I was with Lincoln when he signed the Emancipation. I couldn't believe it. You were there? So then I went back to school in the fall, and there was a Freedom Boat campaign in Mississippi, and I was asked to lead a group of Yaleys and other students down there. So we went down for a couple of weeks. I put a medal on myself for that, but I was quite moved by it. Mississippi Freedom Boat campaign. So I come back to the school, and I see that Dr. King is coming to Bridgeport to speak. And of course I go there to hear him, and he's late. So somebody, I have no idea who it was, knows that I've just like within 2 weeks before I've been in Mississippi on this Freedom Boat campaign. And they asked me if I would speak to fill time because he was late. So I did. I talked about what I saw. And I didn't talk that long that night because somebody told me that Dr. King had arrived. So as I walked up the stage, he walked on. And he shook my hand and said, exact words, "Very good, young man. It was a big deal to me. And it had an effect on me. I say in the book, but it's not totally, of course I have no idea what the voice of Moshe Rabbeinu was like, but I thought to myself, maybe this was what the voice of Moshe Rabbeinu was like. The other thing to say in relationship to the book, as you all well know, Dr. King and a lot of other African American ministers who were disproportionately at the leadership of the civil rights movement quoted Torah and Tanakh all the time. And particularly the story of the Yetziat Mitzrayim was, let my people go. They sang it, they believed it was inspirational. So, have I answered the question?
Yes, okay. But I'll touch on that last point that you mentioned. One of the things when I was reading the book that I paid close attention to is how you read the psukim in the Torah. And one of the readings that you did that I thought was really interesting was about Yetziat Mitzrayim, which obviously features very prominently in the book about from Egypt to Sinai. But you know that we look at Hashem, and Hashem has done many, many things. He created the world, he flooded it, he took care of Noah, he had Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But when Hashem introduces the Aseres HaDibros, he introduces with Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Tzicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am your God who took you out of Egypt. And your read of that I thought was very interesting. You say God prefaces the laws of justice by recalling the prodigious act of justice he had just performed in liberating the Israelites from slavery. He holds up a high and noble standard for human behavior. So Hashem is presenting himself as he's about to introduce justice to the world. And he's going to charge the Jewish people with upholding that justice. He says, I am one who acts with justice, and I want you to copy my model. And what we see over there is that Hashem is offering himself as a role model to humanity. In fact, we call this v'halachta b'drachav, to follow in God's footsteps, literally. And that's why we care for the sick, we take care of the poor, just like God does. And role modeling is really very important. I'll just mention that you don't know this. Nobody in this room knows this, that you're one of my role models in prayer. Did you know that? No. So I remember the first week that you just moved to Riverdale, and I'd like to welcome you to Riverdale for 5 years. And you came and you were sitting, and I was watching you during Chazon Shim's Chazaras Hashan's, and you were sitting there following along in your sitter. And I'd never seen somebody follow along during Chazaras Hashan's before. And it was such an inspirational moment that I try whenever I can to follow, because engaging as much as we can with the words of tefillah as often as we can is something that I learned from you, and I take it with me, and I try to teach it to other people as well. But going back to role modeling,
thank you.
When you were in the Senate, you earned the unofficial title, the conscience of the Senate. Did you see yourself as a role model for America's decision makers in the Senate and for Americans in general? Did you see yourself in that role, and how did that affect you?
Well, there's no question that like a lot of good Jewish kids growing up, my parents wanted me to do the right thing. It sounds primitive, but it had a big effect on me and my sisters and a lot of you and your children in the room. So part of the way, it was part of our responsibility, part of it was the broader concept of Kiddush Hashem. So I can't say that at every time that I had a vote or something of that kind, I thought, no, I had the right thing here, so I'm doing Kiddush Hashem. It wasn't like that. Frankly, in some cases, I can say this here, I think that I probably was too generously praised as in the conscience of the Senate, in part because I was religious. So they kind of assumed that my religious observance was different, and they assumed that. Maybe some of it came from it's an odd, this is like, Noah was a righteous person in his own time. Because I worked a lot across party lines with Republicans. Maybe that was part of it. So I can't say that I was. So it's again a really interesting question. Look, I always felt that I was lucky enough to be in public office, to be a public person, and that I did have a responsibility to conduct myself in a way that was honorable. I used to say I remember once I said to my staff, when I became the Senate Majority Leader in Connecticut, that let's just, we're going to assume that we're never going to intentionally do anything illegal. And we're never going to do anything intentionally that's unethical, maybe still legal. But we really got to, and this was before social media and 24-hour cable news, but I used to call it the Hartford Current front page rule. We have to be certain that if the Hartford Current writes a front page story critical of something I've done, that I can explain it in a way that is understood by people. So maybe that continued as time goes on. And I think a lot of observant Jews feel that same responsibility.
You mentioned that part of what you were known for in the Senate was working across party lines. That's actually one of the themes of Shavuos, is Achdus, Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. The Jewish people, when they camped at Har Sinai, they camped as one. Vayichan is in the singular form. What do you think of the current divided culture in politics in America right now?
Yeah. So actually, one of the essays, I forgot which day, but incidentally, I did write the book. So we used to have a joke on Capitol Hill that if you're a member of Congress and you publish a book, the one requirement is before it's published, you have to read it. So I did write this with Rabbi Kahn, but I've actually been reading it now day by day during the Omer because I didn't have that experience. And I think that I'm pleased with what I read. Now remind me which your question was now. Which was
the divided nature of
yeah,
politics.
okay, one of the essays extracts for homiletic purposes. Be familiar
The
with
best
this.
kind of purpose.
From Dayenu, the line, if we had gone to Mount Har Sinai, and then that would have been enough. And so I raised the question, how could that have been enough? We were going there to get the Torah. And the answer, short essay shorter, is that it's because we were unified. Am Yisrael was one. There are a couple of other places where I try to allude to current division in politics. Part of it is in the tradition of disputation, argument among the rabbis in the development of the Talmud and ever since. With very few exceptions, it was never. They always saw each other as part of the same team. I tell this story, this poignant story of Rav Lakish and Yochanan. Yeah, so one dies.
That is a great story.
So I forget now for the moment, did Yochanan die or Lakish? Anyway, he dies, and the survivor, they've been studying together for years, falls into a deep depression, and his students say, we have to find him another great scholar to learn with him. So they find a scholar whose name I forget, and after a few days, the rabbi throws him out. He says, every time I make a point, all you do is give me 2 other reasons why I'm right. That's not what, let's say it was Rabbi Kish, used to do. You know, he would argue with me, and as a result, he made me better. And you're not good. So, and there was a love obviously between them as a result. So I mean, this is now part of it was that they were committed, and all the people who have been disputatious about Jewish law since, they were committed to the basic system, to the principle, to Klal Yisrael, to Kiddush Hashem, etc., etc. So that kept them united. Here in our politics, this is a topic for a separate evening, but because of money in politics, because the parties control money, because the media has become more partisan, et cetera, because of gerrymandering of House districts, the core constituencies, so-called, the left and the Democratic Party, the right and the Republican Party tend to have disproportionate influence, and members of Congress don't want to negotiate and compromise because it's too risky, and you can't get anything big solved without making some people unhappy. That's the nature of the leadership. So we're not doing anything, and it's because they don't. I go back to my friend McCain. When he came back after his surgery in August of last year for the vote to repeal Obamacare, and he was against Obamacare, and he shocked everybody by voting against the repeal. But what they missed, I think, a lot of people, is that that day, when he came back, he gave a speech on the floor of the Senate, which was an appeal to stop the partisan nonsense, basically to put the country first and your constituents first. And that's why he voted against, because the bill was totally the work of the Republicans, and frankly, just as the original Obamacare was totally the work of the Democrats. So this is a real problem for our society, and we have to come back. It takes leadership. We have to come back to finding people who will put the country first, their constituents first, and be willing to negotiate, compromise, and take risks for the betterment of the country.
Do you think that that culture will change over time? That we will move back to that?
I hope so. You know, we've gone through a period of elections. Certainly the Obama and Trump elections, which in different ways were change elections. They wanted to get me away from what preceded, you know. Obama even more than Trump, although Trump too, because people were so angry at Congress. Trump really is much a different way, that they chose somebody that a lot of them, I think, were worried about, but they weren't sure what he would do, but he was the outsider, and they wanted an outsider. Besides, he had been a successful businessman, apparently. So, and Hillary was the insider, and she was besmirched by the campaign. So I think at some point people are going to realize that they need something more. They need somebody who's really capable of being a leader. I'll just give them a little plug for a group that I'm honored to be the co-chair of. Now my co-chair, John Huntsman, went off to be ambassador to Moscow, so I'm the only chair right now of a group called No Labels, basically to try to encourage more bipartisanship in Congress. And beginning a couple of years ago, we decided the problems are political, they're only going to be solved by politics, so we started to raise money to support candidates in both parties who have a record or a stated intention to work across party lines. And there's now a No Labels Problem Solvers Caucus in the House. 48 members, 24 Republicans, 24 Democrats. In the Senate, it's not quite as organized, but a Democrat, Joe Manchin, Republican, Susan Collins, had something they call the Common Sense Coalition. And you know, we've been raising a fair amount of money. We got involved in two primaries in 2016. One Democrat, one Republican. In both cases, we supported the more moderate of the two candidates. Incidentally, the candidate we supported in the Republican Party was a conservative. He just wasn't crazy. And the Democratic candidate was, I'd say, probably center-left, but he wasn't way out. And we developed a program to get people out who had not voted in the previous primary, mostly more centrist people, and our two candidates won. So we're trying to raise a lot of money now to do the same this year. Hopefully we'll get involved in maybe 20, at best 25 different seats, and try to build this bipartisan group.
Wonderful. Tzlacha, Rabbi, I have one more question.
Thank you.
23 years ago, you and Bob Dole, Senator Bob Dole, sponsored the Jerusalem Embassy Act, to move the U.S. Embassy to Yerushalayim. That was 23 years ago. And in a week and a half, the U.S. Embassy will be opened in Jerusalem. Could you tell us about the legislative process, and what was it like for you, and what is it like for you now?
Yeah, no, it's thrilling for me, though. It took a long time, and Baruch Hashem, I'm going to be in Jerusalem at the embassy opening.
Baruch Hashem. We should all be in
Yeah,
Jerusalem.
really, we'll all be there one day. And it happens just by the strangest coincidence that one of the senior partners in the law firm, I'm part of the senior council, is now our ambassador, David Friedman, so it's quite something. So this was a movement that built up during the 90s, and I mean the basic premise was, it was a matter of international law and custom that a country locates its embassy in the capital that the host country designates as its capital in the city. The host country designates the capital. The only exception, there might have been one other in some small country for some strange reason, was Israel, that we wouldn't put our embassy in the capital, even though Israel was a fellow democracy and, of course, one of our closest allies in the world. And we really concentrated on it, had a lot of support from AIPAC and other groups. And we put in the legislation. President Clinton, who had a good pro-Israel record in his administration, said, because the bill mandated that we recognize Jerusalem as the capital and that we move our embassy there. And President Clinton said he would veto it because he thought it would hurt the peace process, which, remember, had only really officially begun or flowered anyway 2 years earlier, in 1993, with the Rabin Arafat signing on the White House lawn. So we had to make one of those hard decisions in legislating, and the administration said, if you give the president the right to suspend the implementation of the law every 6 months, he won't sign it. This is a little known fact. He didn't sign it. But there is a provision in statute that if the president doesn't sign it or veto it, 10 days after it arrives on his desk, it becomes law. That's what happened. And every president after that, until Donald J. Trump, go figure, you know, Hashem, such a humor. So, and the argument always was, and remember we're talking about a wide range here in party and ideology, Clinton, Bush, 43, and Obama. And the argument was, it will not only hurt the peace process, but there'll be violence on the streets of the Arab world. I mean, it'll be terrible. Now, I admit that the feelings about the peace process are not exactly what they were in '95, because hopes were pretty high then. But I don't know that would have affected Trump. I think he just decided that he was going to do this. It's quite interesting because he knows, I'm going to do a little political analysis here, he knows that he didn't get a majority of the Jewish votes. He got a majority of the Orthodox Jewish votes. But, so he didn't do this for the Jewish vote. Probably, I know he was nudged by some very important Jewish supporters. One, a mild-mannered fellow who is the largest casino operator in the world. And, occasionally has an opinion that he conveys. But I will tell you this, and just talk about, how Hashem works in mysterious ways. The other group that was really pressuring the president to move the embassy was the Christian evangelicals. And so here we are, 23 years, and what I should say, that there were very strong feelings expressed by the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, but there was no terrible violence as had been predicted. And in the Arab world, some expressions of concern, but I tell you, I was by coincidence in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi within a week of the president's announcement, and nobody brought it up. So part of it is that they wanted to talk about Iran, which of course everybody in Israel wants to talk about. So it is different, but there is a message, a lesson here. You've got to be careful about applying it too strictly, which is we still are the strongest nation in the world. Economically, militarily, etc. We have a clout and people depend on us around the world, and we can't be in a position where we feel that something is right or in our national interest, where we don't do it because we're afraid of others' reactions. And I must say that however much I disagree with the president now on other things he does or has done, I give him a lot of credit for this and a lot of hakor tov, really, gratitude for it. Because it's right, it's just, it's right for us as Americans. Because we were letting fears of what countries that are not our equal affect our policy, so I'm very grateful, and I'm very excited to be there.
We are very proud of you for your work on that law and for your work on behalf of America and the Jewish people over all these decades, and wish you many, many more decades, you and Hadassah and your family here in Riverdale and in Israel for a long time to come. Thank you so much.
You're a great interviewer. I'm going to stop there. I used to say, this is the, how things change in a moment. I used to say after a good interview like this, I would have said, Rabbi, Charlie Rose needs somebody to replace him. I was thinking he might retire a little bit.
Thank you so much. With Liberty and Justice is available in the back, and the senator will be signing for his closest friends, which is everybody in this room, at the Tea Learning Store. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.